Good evening, everyone. For anyone that doesn't know me, I'm Maria Balshaw and I'm director at Tate. I am really delighted to see what I think by the time the last few people come in will be another full house here for our talks series at Tate Modern. I know it's going to be a fascinating and really lively conversation.
You know that?
I do. One of my own staff told me exactly that as I was on my way over here. He's heard you talk before. So I know that none of us are going to be surprised to hear what unfolds between the two of you. Kerry, we are really delighted to welcome you. So we've invited Kerry just now for a particular reason, which is not only to hear from him about his work, but also to celebrate the fact that his wonderful painting, Untitled London Bridge 2017, which will become the first work by Kerry to be acquired by the Tate, is currently on display at Tate Britain. That has come to us 12 months after I started as director, and I'm personally still very delighted that one of the very earliest things that Mark asked me to come and view was that work. Actually, even before I had started. So I can genuinely say it was one of my earliest delightful discussions and then decisions that that work needed to come to us in London and here in Tate's collection. This talk is part of an ongoing series of talks by artists and academics, writers and thinkers who we feel are relevant to the programme across Tate and are part of the way in which we want to share artists' thoughts and ideas with our audiences here in London. But in particular, Kerry's talk following Faith Ringgold's just a few weeks ago with Glenn Ligon coming in 2 weeks' time is part of a selection of artists who we've invited to speak here following Soul of a Nation, which was the major exhibition which Mark with Zoe Whiteley and Priyesh Mistry curated here at Tate last year. That hasn't ended. It is currently touring the US. And we are immensely proud that it's been in Arkansas, will be in Brooklyn, and then in Los Angeles. And that represents Tate's ongoing commitment through the acquisition of works, through the making of exhibition, through the hosting of talks, to expanding our sense of the art history of now, talking about the art of the world, the art of America, in ways that are relevant to our audiences here in London, but also across the world. And you'll see a camera over there because this will be filmed and will be on YouTube so that it can be enjoyed by all those that access Tate through digital means. I don't want to say much more because I want to give over the time to the Q&A between Mark Godfrey, our amazing curator, and Kerry James Marshall. But I did just want to say what an important artist we see Kerry as being. He is a storyteller in visual form, and the narratives he shapes are populated with different heroes and heroines. Sometimes imagined or fantastical, but absolutely new political realities that we grasp through his paintings. He engages with and admires the widest range of art historical influences, but he makes us think again about the America that we see today through the eyes of a painter. So we are delighted that he is here tonight, and with that I would like to hand over to our Q&A folks. Thank you very much.
Well, it's fantastic that you're here, and thank you all for coming. My conversation with Kerry began about 5 or 6 years ago in Chicago in his studio, where this was on the walls of the studio, and I was really thrilled to see Tate on the walls of Kerry's studio in Chicago, represented in the poster in this beauty shop, which is the Tate poster from the Chrysophylle exhibition. So it's great that you now are here in London. And I want to start with this painting. Well, we'll come back to it in a bit to talk about some of the things that Maria was mentioning your interest in art histories, because there's another connection to London, which is the Holbein painting, but I'll come back to that in a second. But this painting, I sort of saw it and thought, oh, brilliant, can that be the one for Tate to acquire? And you said, actually, it was going to the Birmingham Museum of Art, which is where you were born. So I want to sort of talk about Birmingham for you, but also to talk about Charles White, who, when you left Birmingham to go and live in Los Angeles, was one of the artists that were most important for you. And one of the works that he was making in the decade that you were looking at his work was a work about Birmingham in the moment of the 60s, which is over here, Birmingham Totem. So the question is really, if you could just say a few words about that move from Birmingham to LA and about the impact of Charles White.
Well, you know, so I was 7 years old when the family moved from Birmingham to LA. And that was too early, in a way, for me to be thinking about artists in any kind of historical sense. Even though while I was in Birmingham, I had already sort of settled for myself on this mission of becoming a person that made pictures. I couldn't have said that it was to be an artist because I didn't know what an artist was at 7 years old. But I knew I had seen some pictures that had excited me that my kindergarten teacher had made available to me. And I had had some experiences at the elementary school I started at, which was a Catholic school called Holy Family, with the kind of spectacle that you experience when you go into a Catholic church chapel. You know, and the kind of spectacle of all those statues and that stained glass windows, all that gold, all that silver, all that white paint, and those high ceilings. So all that stuff had a profound impact on my desire to make things that were as spectacular as the things I was seeing. But the range of things that I thought was spectacular at that time included Valentine's Day cards, Christmas cards, you know, it's like greeting cards, all that stuff that looked like stuff that I couldn't do, but stuff that I wanted to do because it was stuff that had an effect on me, because it all seemed sort of magical to me. And I just knew at the time that I wanted to do that kind of thing. I wanted to make pictures like those. I wanted to make pictures that would make other people feel the way those pictures were making me feel. And so that's literally how I got sort of set on this path to making things. In the process, I was also kind of conditioned to be a compulsive image collector and a person who never saw a book that wasn't worth looking in, never saw a picture that wasn't worth cutting out of a magazine. Thought that almost everything that I saw that I hadn't done myself was interesting. I mean, the stuff that I saw other people doing was always more interesting than what I was doing. And my goal was always to figure out a way to do the thing that those other people were doing. So I wanted to know what it was that made it possible for them to do the kind of work they were doing. So subsequently, as I'm in Los Angeles and getting older, by the time I got to 5th grade, which would have been the time I was about 10 years old, I was doing a book report for what they used to call Negro History Week. And I picked up a book at the library called Great Negroes, Past and Present. And in that book was a biography of this man named Charles White. You know, it didn't have any images of his work because all of the images in the book were illustrations that were done by somebody else. There was a line drawing portrait of Charles White and then a copy that person had made of a work of his. So you really didn't have a sense of his work, but there was something about that man that got my attention, and I couldn't tell you exactly what it was. Now, I wrote a preface to the catalog for the Charles White retrospective that's opening at the Art Institute next month. And in it, I said, well, maybe at the time it was the irony of having a black man named White that got my attention. And so I somehow or other, I latched on to him as a figure that was worth keeping track of. Now, when I subsequently was in junior high school, I was fortunate enough to be given a scholarship to go take a summer drawing class at the Otis Art Institute. At the time, I didn't know Charles White taught there, but the teacher that taught the drawing class for these junior high school kids had a book called Images of Dignity, The Drawings of Charles White. And he took us down to the lecture hall and on an opaque projector showed us pictures from that book. And after we looked at those pictures, he said, well, you know, Charles White has a studio on campus at Otis, and he said it was okay if I brought the class up to take a look inside his studio. And it was that moment when that door opened, you know, and I looked in there and I saw those works, the range of them, and the important thing being that there were works that were just being started, and then there were works that were completely finished. And so you could see at the time that making art was a process, that it was something that people did because of something they knew, and it wasn't something that happened by magic. And that was the moment I knew that I wanted to be that kind of person. Now, oddly enough, so that from that book, Great Negroes, Past and Present, I always assumed that when you read about somebody in a history book, it was somebody who had long since been dead, because the only people who are in history books are dead people. And I had thought Charles White was dead. But I took that book back down to the classroom, and I was copying an image of Frederick Douglass from that book, and Charles White walked into our classroom. And it was that moment at which history, it's like that gap between history and now sort of closes up sort of rapidly, and you see that history is now, that history is living, that people who made history are people that you can not only know, but that you can encounter, that you can have a relationship with in some way or another. But he came into our classroom, I was copying that drawing from the book. I was terrified just by his presence. And then I was ashamed because I was copying a picture of his that I was almost sure he was gonna be pissed off because I was doing such a bad job at it. But I decided that when I graduated from high school that I was gonna go to school at Otis simply because he was there. And from that moment on, I just looked for every bit of information I could find about Charles White, every image I could find, everything about him that I could gather. And then there was an article about him in Ebony magazine. And in that article, it had a biographical sketch of him. And in that biographical sketch, it mentioned how when he was a child, his mother gave him a paint set for Christmas. And while she was at work, he tore down the window shade in the house and made a painting on the window shade. And when she came home, he wanted to show her this wonderful thing he had made, to which he got a beating. But because I had this idea that I wanted to be like Charles White in every way I could, so I did pictures on window shades too, because Charles White had done a picture on window shade. And when I was 15, I made a work. I tried to make an original artwork of my own in the style of Charles White, but painted in oil paint on a window shade. It was the first oil painting I ever made in 1971. And it was, if you know Charles White's work, this work, Birmingham Totem, is something that he did sort of from the late 50s to the early 60s and into the 70s. Before that, in the 30s and 40s, he did a work that was cubist inflected, you know, with these massive sort of forms, with these broad planes and things like that. And I tried to do an original work of my own using that particular style of Charles White's. Because what I was looking for, and the reason that work appealed to me so much, was because it seemed to demonstrate that there was a key to understanding the way in which images operated. So if you understood something about the structure of things, then that opened up a lot of opportunity, a lot of possibilities for you. And I was always looking for those structural underpinnings that made things what they were. Because if you take the surface gloss of things, you know, there's a lot that's hidden in the process and the way things accumulate over time. And I just wanted to figure out ways to peel that back. And understand what was really happening underneath, because clearly that either it was done because people were magically talented, or they had to know something that I didn't know.
I'm I think we could probably talk about Charles White the whole night, but I'm going to move on to your work and a real crucial difference that happens in your work around 1980, and a difference also from Charles White in as much as a different way of painting the black body. And your decisions to first of all think about titles in relation to paintings, and also to think through Ellison's book, Invisible Man, and to start using extremely black pigments in the way you would paint black bodies. And what was at stake in those decisions at that time for you?
Well, I mean, there were a couple of things I think. One, so I'm going to have to mention Charles White again.
That's all right.
So now here's the thing. So, I mean, if you know the history and the development of Charles White's work, I mean, you can see the man was a master draftsman. I mean, sort of unparalleled in some ways, in terms of his skill, and in terms of the kind of the density and the kind of sensibility that he projected through those figures. I mean, which is why that book was called Images of Dignity. I mean, that was a kind of power in his representation of black figures that I really hadn't seen in the work of anybody else who had ever painted a picture of a black person. I'd never seen anything like it. There wasn't anything that matched it. But while at the same time there wasn't, I thought I was looking at work that was unparalleled, I also recognized that I never saw Charles White's work in art history books. And so I'm saying, well, what's up with that? It's like, what is it? It's like, so if the work can look that good, be that well made, and be that deeply invested in, then what is it about what's the difference between this work and all the other work that seems to show up in the art history books and in the museums? Like, what's the difference between those things? So so I had to figure out sort of what's at stake in these different sort of hierarchies of value when it comes to work. And if this is insufficient to make the cut, then what do you have to do in order to get there? And so what that led me to explore was sort of all of the dimensions of all of the ways in which every artist had ever thought about or believed it was possible to make a picture. So, I mean, if you think about, and this is the way I think about myself in relationship to art history and to the idea of making works. So if I was born in 1955. I mean, and if you look at the narrative of art history, and you look at all of the transformations that took place from the beginning of time, from the moment when human beings first started making pictures, started making objects, started doing sculpture and building architecture. If you look at all the things that people did over all that time, and you come up through the 20th century and you look at the ways in which other options were put into play and put on the table for what artists could do, and the way those things transformed the possibilities that other people could explore. Well, I figured in 1955, I had to go through all of those things and experience them internally. I had to try to do all those things so that I would know how they worked by doing it, as opposed to knowing how they worked by reading about it. And so I went through every phase of art making you can imagine. And in the period just before I made this painting, I was doing mixed media abstract collages. And the moment, and so and all of this was dedicated to a certain kind of process of internalizing the logic of all these things, so that I could find a way of synthesizing these things into an image that might be singularly my own, something that I could claim to be my own. And so this painting is done. This is an egg temper painting on paper. It's really small. It was important that, for me, that it was an egg temper painting because the medium specificity of it had historical value. And it said something about the origins of painting and what painting was before we arrived at oil painting, you know, when frescoes and egg temper painting was the medium of choice. So all those things were really important. But I was trying to also figure out a way to I mean, you have to incorporate minimalist sort of strategies, you know, looking at the monochrome, all of those things. And it all happened to coincide with the moment I was reading Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man. And then this notion of simultaneity sort of that Ralph Ellison described, where you can be simultaneously present and absent. And that presence and absence was the device that I latched on to when I started painting a black figure against a black background, and then figure out a way that you can create separation between the image and the ground by just simply changing the color temperature of the blacks. So you could paint a warm black figure against a cool black background, and even though the values might be the same, you could still register a distinction between those two things because the temperature of those two colors would create the separation. And so that's when I started playing around with this sort of optical, this sort of visual game of perception, where you can have a thing that was simultaneously there and alternately not there. And so that's how I arrived at this picture. Now, this title thing, you know, that's a kind of holdover from some surrealist kind of attitudes where you have these elaborate poetic titles. And I mean, and it had something to do with the Ellison title as well, but the title of that painting was a portrait of the artist as a shadow of his former self. But it's also, that title is also important because I think when I started out as an artist, and because of the process I went through and the trajectory I followed, I was never really trying to be a personally self-expressive artist. I mean, I really was thinking that I was always dealing with ideas, and the ideas were about perception, they were about painting, and they were about history, they were about all those other things. And so I was never making works that were about me, even though I called that a portrait of the artist as a shadow of his former self. It wasn't a self-portrait. That title was just a device, a kind of a shield, you know, that at least set up the proposition that I could be doing a thing that was self-representative. But what I was really trying to do at the time was to develop a way of representing blackness as a kind of phenomena, but also blackness as a kind of rhetorical device, because that's the way we talk about ourselves and we describe ourselves. When we say black people, we don't really mean literally black people, although you can see some people who literally embody the idea of blackness in themselves. And so I started trying to figure out ways to make that concrete.
And this continues into the 90s and beyond in paintings like this, and then more recently.
Well, but to establish, so you established the model in the portrait of the artist as a shadow of his former self, but the idea only fulfills its purpose when you can demonstrate. And this is something that doesn't happen until over time, when you can demonstrate that the black is also chromatic, that the black is not a reductive, it's not an absence, it's not a thing that's one-dimensional, that it's as chromatically rich as every other color that exists within the spectrum, within the canvas. So you could take, it's like in a painting where you can have cerulean blue, cobalt blue, ultramarine blue, phthalo blue. Well, that's 4 different blues you can pick straight out of the jar. So that's already that's chromatically rich. And the same thing goes with all the reds, with all the greens and everything else. Somehow or other, people think that the black is the only thing that's reductive in a single thing. But if you buy paint, for people who do paint, you know you can buy an ivory black, you can buy a Mars black, you can buy a carbon black, and those things are as different from each other as each of those blues are. And so that means that the black is as chromatically rich as everything else. And so that's how. So from that painting, that's that's what led to me being able to now embed a figure that is painted with black paint within a painting that has all the other variations of chromatic richness that you would expect to see in any kind of painting. So it's not like the black the black is a black hole where everything all of a sudden becomes diminished because the black figure is represented that way. It's like everything else. And so that's why the figures are always painted with black. There's no other thing in any of the paintings that uses black paint in any way at all. Not in a mixture, not in anything else. Everything else is painted chromatically within a color spectrum. The black is painted with black paint, but it's a color spectrum too. So that was always the challenge. Is how do you demonstrate that? You know, how do you show that black is not reductive? You make it as rich as everything else. And so I take those three basic black colors that you can buy straight out of a jar, and I enhance them further by making them chromatically change so that I don't have to use a value scale of white to gray to black to create mass, you know, to develop form. So I add a cobalt blue to the carbon black. Or what ends up being in some of the paintings, what ends up being the lightest value is either yellow ochre or what's the other? Sienna, raw sienna. Those things not only do they give you a lighter value, but they give you a warmer tone. And so I'm still playing with warm and cool tones in those blacks, just like I would in any other range of color mixture. So that's literally the crux of what I'm doing. And it's saying, and once you do that, then there's seems to be infinite possibility to find ways in which to treat that figure, spaces in which to insert that figure, you know, and without diminishing its complexity, you know, by having people simply believe that it's a kind of simple reductive treatment. So anyway.
My next question is about the place where your work is shown. And this is the museum that you would visit as a child. And on top is the museum in your hometown, Chicago, and then the museum in New York where your retrospective was held at the Met. And you've always had a great faith in the museum. And in this respect, I think you're different from some other artists of your generation who wanted to place their work outside of museums or who, you know, resist the calls of museums when they come to ask for retrospectives. But you really believe in the museum as a place where publics can and audiences can access art. And I was just wondering if you can say a few words about the importance of the museum for you.
Well, but you know, the thing is, the museum was the first place where I was able to experience the full spectrum of possibilities when it came to making images and objects. So at the LA County Art Museum, there were two things had a profound impact on me when I went to the LA County Art Museum on a field trip from my elementary school. You know, and everybody in here, it's like we were just in Vienna just before I came here. And as we were going out of the museum, you know, there were like lines and lines and lines of school kids being brought in. So that's 50 years after I was taken into a museum. So they're still doing it. And they're still showing kids those same pictures I would have seen when I went there 50 years ago. And their introduction to the idea of what art is still being shaped by that first experience they had. So it doesn't look to me like museums are going to be going out of business anytime soon. So, and if when you go into the museum, you think there's something missing in the museum's collection, the answer to it is not to stop going to the museum, but to figure out how to resolve the deficiency that the museum has by introducing into the museum the things you want to see. To me, that's the way it works. I mean, there's nothing about the shape of the museum that is unchangeable. There's nothing about it. There's nothing about the shape of art history that's unchangeable. But if you don't believe you have any kind of agency with regards to how those things change, then you're in a sorry state. Because then you're always in an environment where you think things are being imposed on you that are somehow inconsistent with the things that you're interested in or the things you want. When in fact, I mean, those museums didn't exist at one time. Somebody decided they wanted to put that stuff in there. And so I always say, well, in the same way that I thought that when I looked at all of these artworks in our history books, that I wanted to be able to do those things too. I just started doing them. I didn't ask anybody if I could. And I wasn't waiting for anybody to tell me I couldn't. And if they had told me I couldn't, I wasn't listening. So it's like, well, what is this whole thing really all about? I mean, is the museum a living institution or is it a mausoleum? I mean, is it a place where you go to see dead things? Well, to the degree that it enlivens the possibilities for you to make new things, well, to me, the museums always remain alive. And when I went to the museum, I saw stuff I was excited about. So the two things at the LA County Art Museum that had the strongest impact on me was a painting by Veronese. They had two paintings by Veronese, the Allegory of Navigation. I remember them vividly, too. And then there were two big figures, and they looked like superheroes in those paintings. And the other thing was a Sanufo executioner figure. I don't know if you remember what those are. That's that figure in burlap with the feathers on the top of his head, got two sticks for the arms. I saw that, and I saw in the Veronese painting, that Sanufo figure scared me to death. But it was as powerful as the Veronese paintings. And so then you're confronted with this sort of experience where now you have to figure out how to close the space between what those things look like and the kind of power they display. If this thing can be as powerful as this thing, then how do you bridge that gap? And that's a part of what I felt like I've always been interested in trying to do as well. And so when I left the museum, I was thinking to myself, I want to be in there too. That's what I want. I want to be in there with the rest, with these guys. I want to be up in there with Rembrandt. I want to be up in there with the Veronese. I want to be up in there with that Sanufo figure too. And I want to be up in there with those Japanese woodblock prints. I want to be up in there with those Chinese silk paintings on screens. I want to be up in there with that stuff because all that stuff was amazing to me. It was all amazing. And over time, as I kept going back to the museum, time and time again, you see, I mean, it's like you just start looking, if you just wander through the museum and you see the stuff that's there, I mean, you don't have to engage with everything all the time because everything isn't always interesting. But I never went to the museum and didn't find more than a few things that were really exciting to me, never. And I've never been to a museum anywhere in the world that didn't have a few things that were really exciting to me, not ever. And so I expect museums will always be like that as long as there are people who are invested in keeping them alive by making stuff that aims to get in there and help keeping the energy going.
Now, one of the things about the museum is, the history of art that's presented in there, the different histories. But you're particularly interested in, well, many histories, and you mentioned some of them, but one of them is a history of sort of grand European painting. And in many of your works, there are kind of references to wranglings with that history. And I was wondering if you can just talk through a couple of them. I mean, I've got slides of this, and then this is the painting I was referring to before from the National Gallery. There's others, the painting that was in the last show here in London at David Zwirner is a painting that connects to, very classic paintings, Courbet, the Velázquez and Vermeer. And we could go through many others, but perhaps if you could just mention something about, these references and how you play with and wrangle with this history.
Well, I mean, I think I said earlier, so what do we want from an encounter with pictures anywhere in the museum or in the gallery? So, well, what do we want? So why do people still go to the art galleries? It's like, how is it that now, 500 years after that Holbein painting was made, people are still making paintings. And you can see that people are still making paintings 3,000 years after in Egypt paintings were being made. And so what are we doing here? And why do we choose the things that we choose to do? So me as an artist, I mean, given what I know about what's possible for an artist to make, why do I choose the things that I choose to do? So there's something in what I'm doing. I mean, it says something about what is interesting to me. And what's the thing that's most interesting to me is how do you take? See, I think there should be a kind of cumulative value that comes from the legacy of making from human enterprise. So this stuff, it adds up. It should add up to something. And so what I tend to be most interested in doing are the things that are the most difficult to do. I'm not interested in anything that's really easy to do. I mean, the reason I don't do collage anymore now is because collage, and for me, a lot of collage and assembly are too forgiving. There are too many gaps in collage that don't require a certain kind of precision, that don't require a kind of depth of consideration, so that intellectually even, that a lot of what happens with collage and with the collages I was making, I mean, there's a good deal of chance that occurs in the process of making collages. And I'm not interested in that anymore because it's not challenging enough. And so I'm interested in, it's like, I read, there was a piece in Art News magazine a long, long time ago on John Cage. It's on John Cage and Marcel Duchamp. And John Cage was saying, well, I'm not interested in the kind of chance that Duchamp is interested in. I'm not interested in the kind of chance in which anything is likely to happen. What I'm interested in is setting up a series of parameters and limitations in which the thing that I'm looking for particularly is more likely to happen than not. A particular thing that I'm looking for. And what he's not looking for is any old kind of phenomena. And so I'm interested in that kind of thing where you set up a set of propositions and you simply you play them out and see if you can make them work effectively. And so to me, when I look at paintings like that Holbein painting, and you have pictures with this anamorphic sort of images in it, it's like, I mean, to me, the ability to figure out how to make that anamorphic image work, that's interesting to me. And figure out how to use it in a picture that is developed with the kind of precision. I mean, people who live here in England go to the National Gallery, they see that painting all the time. You look at that thing is remarkable.
What were you doing?
It's almost unbelievable that it was made.
Tell me about what it meant to kind of quote from that and change it over here.
Well, but the thing is, I was interested in, before I ever even saw that picture, I was interested in Holbein because there's something about the precision in those Holbein paintings that appealed to me. And it's the reason why, I mean, so Roger van der Weyden and those Flemish painters, that stuff appeals to me because there's something about that precision, that level of precision, that matters to me. And it matters to me in the way that it's like if you think about the way Aang, so I would say that Aang was one of the first conceptual artists. Because there's a quote from Aang where he's talking about how the painters should eliminate from the work they're doing all traces of the artist's hand, all of the brushstrokes. You shouldn't see any of the way in which that picture was made, because it says what it shows you is the artist's hand and the artist's personality. It doesn't show you what the artist's idea was. And so how do you get to this thing where it's about where the picture is the manifestation of a process of thinking through an idea that you're trying to project? So how do you do that? And so I'm interested in that in work, because I've been through going through all of those exercises I described earlier, where I was trying to figure out why all of these other paintings work the way they work. I mean, I went through that, and I kind of know I know some of the limits of what chance in engagement with material and surface and with image. I know something about the way that works and what it generates. And my thing is always, what's the most you can say about a picture when you encounter it, and how long can you spend analyzing it, sort of taking it apart, figuring out how it fits together, and seeing how it does what it claims to do. So I'm interested in that kind of thing. And so that's what I get from, when I look at the paintings like the Holbein painting, I'm looking for, I'm trying to understand I'm trying to understand the way he thought through the activity of making the picture to arrive at the object that it ends up being. So that's what I'm trying to do. And
I want to fast forward a little bit to look at the painting that's now in the Tate collection. Maybe if you can take us through some of the thinking that and the thinking and the making that led to this painting. So you can all see this painting now at Tate Britain, as Maria said, and it was completed last May, and it's already hanging over here. So in the centre is someone advertising a restaurant that is named after a Lauda Equiano, and the painting is sort of set in this place, which is in the middle of Arizona, but is where London Bridge was taken to in the 1960s. So those are
it was 1971.
1971.
1971.
So tell us how the ideas for this painting came together.
Well, you know what? So some of this goes back to that first meeting Mark and I had when he came to the studio, and he was interested in the beauty shop painting, which is called School of Beauty, School of Culture. And he was interested in it, and it was clear to me that there was something about the Britishness of some of the references that he had latched on to. And since that wasn't available, and I thought, well, I want to make a picture for the Tate. I want to make a picture. So if I was going to be represented in the Tate's collection, what kind of picture would I want to be represented with? And so, I mean, because I really do have a deep interest in history, in what we call Black history. You know, not just as African American history, but Black history across the diaspora. I'm interested in that as much as I'm interested in art history. And so when the bridge first opened in 1971, I was aware of it because it was a phenomenon. It was broadcast on network news as this amazing, crazy sort of thing that was happening in Arizona. And so I knew about it. And when I started thinking about the kind of painting I would want to make for the Tate, trying to figure out how to make a picture that dealt with some things that I thought were really meaningful, the Olaudah Equiano narrative and the London Bridge narrative seem to have a lot of overlaps. And the place where they overlap, to me, was displacement. And so this idea that London Bridge is in Arizona and Olaudah Equiano ended his life here in England, you know, but had been kidnapped and sold into slavery, those two things seem to have something to do with each other to me. And so I set about trying to figure out how to make a picture that would kind of wrestle with, deal with in one way or another those two phenomena, but always went back to the notion of displacement. So that's how the picture started. And now I happen to also know about the painting that Andre Derain did called London Bridge. So it was that picture, and I knew that picture, and so that became important to me as an element of the process, and of course, the Seurat painting, which is in the museum in Chicago at the Art Institute, also came into play in part because there's something about the way Seurat makes paintings that appeals to me too, in the way that I described earlier. Because if you think about the way this whole pointillist ideal developed, he's trying to create a kind of scientific method of making pictures. And to bring Duchamp back into the conversation again, there was a quote from Duchamp where he says, "I like Seurat's paintings because Seurat makes paintings like a carpenter, builds paintings like a carpenter." And that idea, just this notion of being in control of the building of a thing with that kind of precision, I just like that. And so I wanted to make a painting that embodied all of this, that had all of these things in it all at once. And so I set about finding reference material on the London Bridge, taking a view of it that also incorporated, there's a Turner painting called, what is that, the Wind, Mist, and Fire, or something. It's that train coming across the bridge.
Sounds right.
Something like, something. It's something like that, It's the wind, the mist, the rain, some blah, blah, blah. The smoke or something. But anyway, so I got all this British stuff in my head. And I'm just trying to figure out a way to synthesize all these things so that I can make a picture that once operated on the same scale of those history paintings that we were talking about in terms of the grand narrative tradition. It's like that monumentality of scale matters. The complexity of the narrative matters. So how to figure out how to manage, like 50 or 60 figures in a painting, that's a feat that sort of matters. And so that's how it began.
There's a couple of things, though. I mean, you talked about Black history, but one of the things I think about the painting is it makes you think how successful it is to commemorate Black history in a spot like this, in a tourist destination in Arizona, and whether the people in the painting are looking at this placard and looking at Equiano's image or ignoring the guy in the center of the painting. There's that, and then there's also the rope that's swinging above his head, and that was, I think, quite a relatively late addition, or one of the last things that you did in the painting, and it. Ropes come into your work in many ways. This is a painting in the Walker Arts Centre, a nautical scene, and rope makes sense there. But ropes also appear in the works that you've done. It's very difficult probably to see this image, but it's a series of
it's a triptych of photographs.
Triptychs of photographs, which are based on one of the most horrific and famous images of lynching. And where you isolate some of the women in the crowd who are looking towards the camera, but when you actually see the work, you can see the ropes of the person who's lynched from the tree in the background. So rope, and I was wondering if you can just say how that rope ended up above his head and what that means about America now and the continuation of racism and violence right now.
Well, but there are a couple of things. I mean, this displacement thing is actually the key to the whole picture. I mean, and you kind of have to know a little bit about Equiano, aka Gustavus Vasa, for the picture to start to make some kind of sense. Now, so yes, there's a figure that's inappropriately dressed for the place that he is peddling the wares, let's say. So here you have a man dressed on in a palace guard's uniform at a resort place in the desert. So he is obviously overdressed and overheated. He's trying to sell something that is also kind of out of place, representing a figure that was out of place. That figure is sort of invested in everything British you can possibly think of. And even the things that he's invested in are kind of out of whack. Because, there's a picture of Queen Victoria, It's not at the time that Equiano lived in England. So it's the way in which all of these things that don't quite mesh, around that figure and his isolation from the crowd that does appear to be just simply ignoring him, that he seems to not be the focus of anybody's attention. I mean, those things are all important, in part because it's like, I could probably count on one hand the number of black people that live in Lake Havasu City, Arizona, probably, or the number of black people who think Lake Havasu City is a great place to go for a summer vacation. And so these are typically not the kinds of things that a lot of black people are invested in. Not the kinds of places they're invested in. But the thing is, like, the only reason that town is there is because the bridge is there. Really, the town kind of grew up around the bridge. There wasn't even any water there going under the bridge. They cut a channel from Lake Havasu so the water would go under the bridge, as the man said, so the bridge would have something to do.
But the rope.
But the rope.
Yeah.
Sometimes the rope is just the rope.
Really?
Well,
I mean, it's right above his head.
Well, yeah, I know. That's purely coincidental. But think about it. I mean, so I am hyper aware of the implications of putting certain things in proximity to other things. Yeah. And I know it is possible to draw the conclusion that rope has something to do with lynching, but it doesn't. It actually doesn't. The rope happens it happens to be there because annually at Lake Havasu City they have this balloon festival.
Yeah.
And those balloons, it's like if you ever seen people going up and coming down in the balloon, they got to have that rope dangling down there so somebody on the ground can grab it and help pull them down and tie them to something so they would stop drifting. That's why. And you see all those balloons going over there. That's simply why that rope is hanging there. Mark?
Yeah. Okay, I'm just going to ask you about one more.
Now,
one more picture, which is
that's a different story altogether. With the heirlooms and accessories was a whole different thing.
This was maybe the next work you did after, and this will be my last question. But I saw it last summer. Small painting, much smaller than the one that Tate bought, about this big. And features two people looking quite quizzically at what seems to be an abstract painting. Mm-hmm. And I've talked about this painting with a number of people who are very interested in abstract paintings done by Black American artists in the 60s and 70s. Mm-hmm. And many of us in our conversations were sort of speculating, are they looking at a Sam Gilliam, which is this one? Are they looking at a Frank Bowling? Or maybe it's just another painting, but they're looking quizzically at abstraction. Mm-hmm. And I think you look quizzically at abstraction, and I was wondering if you can unpack this a bit.
Quizzically? Well, but it's more than just that they're... Well, let's put it this way. I mean, if there's this kind of there's a kind of there's a notion that somehow or other abstraction is the end game of painting. That along with photography signal the imminent end of painting, and in particular the end of representation in painting. And so you have to think, so when people paint abstract paintings, what are they? Why did people paint abstract paintings at all? Because at a moment in the history of painting as a kind of activity, people actually believed that the trajectory of painting was leading to a moment in which representation would come to an end, and you would end up with these objects that exist as a phenomena in their own right, independent of any kind of referential kinds of relationships. Now, that period in which artists were trying to get to this sort of 0 degree, you know, as what Malevich called it, to get to this place where you sort of arrived at this sort of ontological beginning of the idea of what a painting could and couldn't be. That period can be framed historically to have come to an end at a certain moment, probably in the mid-1950s. And yet, when people start making abstract paintings in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, you say, well, why are they making abstract paintings? Well, on some level, they're making abstract paintings because it's the thing to do. It's the way to be seen as being contemporary, or to be seen as being modern, and also a way of being thought of as operating within the sort of advanced kind of phase of where painting has arrived. But what subsequently what we know is that sort of representation never went anywhere. Its viability was never completely undermined. Its utility still performed some useful functions, in part because as human beings, you know, we're somehow incapable of doing away with things that we're incapable of doing away with things that we like, you know, that we once really enjoyed. And the things that we once really enjoyed, we want to be able to enjoy them again. And generations of people who never got a chance to participate in the things that were being enjoyed by other people at that time, they want to do it too. So, the question ends up being, well, why do people paint abstract paintings? And why would black people paint? So you take black artists who want more than anything else to participate in the art world as equals amongst other painters who are equals, to be seen as having contributed something that was worthwhile to a history that everybody wants to be a part of on some level, that everybody appreciates because everybody was introduced to it at about the same stage of their development. It's like among those kids who are being taken to museums 50 years ago and today. So when you go into a museum and you don't see that you are participating in any aspect of the way that museum is operating and the things that are being valued within it, if you are always seen on the outside of that, it makes sense that you want to be a part of that thing in one way, in some way or another. So there were a lot of black artists who thought that the only way they could become a part of that was to do abstract work that didn't show on its face or suggest on its face that they were black people doing it, because they thought if it did, that they would somehow be dismissed. So that's one thing. But the other side of it, for me, was that this attempt to try and erase the reality of your own existence as a particularly black individual, to me, is problematic. So I want to come in with everything I got. It's like I want to come in with my nappy hair, with my dark skin, with my brown. I want to come in with all of that. And I want to demonstrate that I could be equal to everything else that was ever being done on those terms with all of that. And then if I decide I want to do abstract work later, I can do that too. But it won't be because I'm trying to hide or erase something about my identity that I don't want people to be aware of, because I think they might apply a negative value to the thing I'm making because of it. So in a way, I mean, so in a way, a picture like this is a kind of a it's a kind of an essay on, you know, having it both ways. You know, can I have it both ways?
Right. We're going to open it to the floor, and there's microphones. There's one on either side, and we've got about half an hour for questions.
But you didn't show the blot. Are you waiting for that or something?
No, we could show the blot, but I'd like to get some questions from the audience. I've got plenty of other images that we could show if there's no questions from the audience, but I'm sure there will be. And there's one right back there, in the middle. And thanks for your patience while you wait for these microphones.
Hi, Kerry. I'm Leslie Primo. I'm an art historian. I was wondering about the school of culture and the school of beauty painting. Is it also referencing the school of Athens? And if so, why?
Well, you know, not directly. Although that school of Athens painting, formally, structurally, compositionally, there's some elements in this painting that reflects some of the same sort of architectonic compositional devices that were used in the way that painting was built up. But the thing is, like, it's not that there's always a single source for a picture, because what all of the things I do are a reflection of is the way in which I've internalized the totality of this history of Western painting. Because let's face it, you know, for most of us, you know, the history of art that we are introduced to and we come to know, and the thing that we internalize comes from, I mean, it's almost all based on Italian. It's like early Italian Renaissance painting. It's like from Cimabue to Giotto, boom, up. And those ideas of what constitutes a picture, you know, those things appeal to me in the ways that I described earlier. So in terms of sensibility, you say, I see myself, I align myself in terms of sensibility with the Florentines more than I do with the Venetians. And why? If you think about, in Florence, the primary mode of picture representation for a long time was fresco. And the idea that in a fresco, it's like you don't wait till you get up on the wall to start figuring out what you're going to do. You figure it all out ahead of time. And so they built up this sort of model of architecture in pictures that gave them a certain kind of precision and a certain kind of certainty that once they got up on the wall and started painting, they just filled it in. Because fresco is not that forgiving as a medium. Oil painting is really forgiving as a medium. You know, it doesn't dry really fast. You can wipe it off, you know.
Is Veronese then an anomaly for you?
Well, only if you accept that that oil paint, that because Veronese was primarily an oil painter, painted on canvas. In that case, yes. But he's not an anomaly because what I'm more interested in with Veronese is the early work. In the same way that with Titian, I'm more interested in Titian's early work than I am in Titian's later work. And I'm more interested in the work that came from a period in which they had also been schooled in the traditions of the Florentines too.
But they are both Venetian.
But they are both Venetian. But the thing is, like, they didn't start, that stuff didn't start loosening up until later in their career. In the beginning, it was tight. And those paintings that I said I saw at the museum that were Veronese, they were a whole lot like the Sibyls in Michelangelo's ceiling, Sistine Chapel ceiling. Formally and structurally, in the way they were done, they were a lot like that.
Thank you.
Down in here.
Hi, I'm Matthew Krishanu. I'm a painter. I'm interested in the construction of your image, the fact that you kind of make a world, very much your own world, in the paintings. I was wondering how much is invention and how much is observation? For instance, when you were talking about the London Bridge painting, I wondered, did you actually see that guy? Or was it something that you invented later and then overlaid of your experience of the Arizona, the bridge there? And generally, you know, do you, just like you were talking about with the frescoes, do you plan it out in detail in drawings first, for instance, before you even begin the painting?
Yeah, well, I mean, you know what? So over time, things change. So I used to plan everything out. I used to do a lot of drawings before I started a picture. I don't do that anymore. I used to. So how much is? So I've never been to Lake Havasu City. Because it really is, it's for the purpose of making a picture, it's not important to go there. So a good deal of what, except for some features of the architecture that you can get from photographs and things like that, I mean, the setting itself and the scene, this is all invented. Everything is made up. The details are supplied by information that you can gather from other kinds of sources. In the School of Beauty, there's a place was around the corner from my studio called the School of Beauty Culture. It was a beautician's school. And I used that as the basis of the painting, but otherwise everything in the picture is invented. Everything, everything. And when I say everything, I mean everything. So the clothes that those figures are wearing are clothes that I and my studio assistant, who is a fashion designer, made and designed ourselves. So that in every painting you see of mine, there's not a single. This is an important thing. So in these works that I'm doing, what I've also strove to do, or striven to do, one of those. Strive to do, what I strive to do, is to also eliminate from the paintings I'm making every aspect of the photographic in the work. I don't want any of that, any elements of the photographic in the work that I'm doing. Because we've gone through a phase in which the photographic as an emblem of image making has had a profound effect on the way in which paintings look and what people do. I don't want any of that in my paintings. And so I developed the way I'm working. I don't use photographic sources except when it comes to knowing that there's a detail that you want to fit into a thing. I don't use photographic sources that give me lighting cues. You know, none of that. I don't want any of that in the work. And so I'm working in a way that avoids the effect that kind of source material will generate. And so from the when you're talking about invention, the things that I make. So in that School of Beauty, the mirrors that have the frame, it's like I make a model. I made a model. I made those. I took some gold doilies, cut them up, and I cut a heart-shaped mirror, put the gold doilies around it, and that gave me the information I wanted to work with to make my painting. That's how I do it now. And I'm doing it even more now. I mean, so I'm making movies in a lot of ways the way I would do production design for making a film. So I make my pictures like I'm making a movie. So I do, right now I'm building sets for all of the locations, and I have a comics project I've been working on called Rhythm Master. I'm making sets for all of those things, and the clothes we started making these clothing as costumes so that, I mean, you have to costume your pictures the same way you would costume a movie. So I'm doing it all like that now because I want everything to be an invention of mine in the picture. I don't want it to refer to something else that everybody already knows exists. I want it to be just off the side of something. So all of the clothes are made from things that weren't intended to be clothes in the first place. So the patterns, we started by taking silk ties and stuff like that and taking patterns that are on ties and making those into garments so that a couple of things would happen in the process, that the scale of the pattern is not the same scale that the pattern would be if it was on a piece of fabric that was made to be made into a garment. So you end up with all this information that you can then play around with and do what you want with, as opposed to relying on the existence of something else that is already there. So anyway,
yeah,
that's
in the middle. Okay. Along.
Hi, Kerry. My name's Richard Adeji. I'm an artist myself. My question, because I'm interested in figuration and the old masters as well. So I was having a conversation with a friend of mine recently, and in our conversation talking about European art history, the thing that came up was that, you know, when we look at these models of picture making through, you know, the ways European artists make art, is there a danger for black artists to sort of, you know, uphold that or look at that and say, you know, this way of picture making is an ideal way of picture making, you know, especially for generations that will come afterwards, is what, you know, sort of arose within the conversation. So he was critiquing me and saying, you know, you're looking at, you know, a lot of European models and ways of making pictures. So my question to you is sort of how do you sort of see yourself in that? And also, just another question, sorry, in terms of Rhythm Master, for you, what is the importance of, you know, as a black man creating that sort of mythology, which we have, you know, been deprived of, or which we haven't had the opportunity to have a lot of? Because if you go to the National Gallery, you have a lot of paintings where, you know, you have like the Action paintings or the Venus paintings where there's a lot of European mythology. And, you know, in the creation of mythology of the society, the image of that society is sort of bolstered globally. So, you know, for you, I would just like to get your, you know, your opinion on how important Rhythm Master is for you, and, you know, in the idea of creating a mythology for yourself.
Oh, it's crucial. Crucial. So, I mean, the Rhythm Master, I mean, as a project, it exists primarily because of the absence of that kind of superhero-like narrative within mainstream sort of comics world, the mainstream comics world, in particular as a phenomena that's developed by and referential to a kind of black cultural reality that can assume the same kind of primacy in the imagination of anybody who encounters it. So it's like, can you, because on the one level, say, can I develop a narrative framework and a series of characters that can assume the same kind of importance in the culture that Superman, Batman, X-Men, Spider-Man, the Fantastic Four, the Incredible Hulk, the Mighty Thor. It's like all you can go down the line. Can I do something like that that becomes as much a part of the cultural imagination as those have already? If I can't, then I am always trapped in a paradigm in which I am always required to reinforce the existing model that's been given to me. So at some point, you got to take up the challenge to break the paradigm and create something that does the same thing. And so I'm only doing that project because that's the mission, that's the goal. Can I do that too? Because it goes to what I was saying earlier. I mean, if I mean to participate as an equal amongst other people who invent things, then I have to demonstrate that I can do the same thing. That I can do it, and I can do it on my terms, and everybody will like it the same way they like everything else. So what does that mean? That means I have to think I know something about the way in which those kinds of systems operate. I have to know something about the way in which those kinds of things take hold in people's imaginations. I have to know something about the way those things work. And if I do my homework right, and I solve that problem, then, well, I don't have to depend on Marvel's project of the Black Panther to find superheroes that are relevant to black people. I don't have to follow Stan Lee and Jack Kirby. I can be alongside Stan Lee and Jack Kirby and say, well now, it's not just Stan Lee and Jack Kirby, it's Stan Lee, Jack Kirby, and Kerry James Marshall. But I'm saying, and the thing is, so that sounds sort of egotistical and kind of arrogant. It is. but what's wrong with that? I mean, what are we trying to do? It's the question of what are we really trying to do here? I mean, what do we want? Do we want to, do we want to rely on, see, my thing is though, it's like, I don't want to have to rely on the kindness and generosity of others to put me in the place that I want to be. If there are obstacles to me getting where I want to go, I have to figure out what the strategies are that will get me around those obstacles. I have to figure that out. Nobody else is supposed to do that for me. I have to do that. And the only thing that would make that possible for me is if I think I know something about the way those things work. So it's like you're talking about the sort of Western art historical dynamic. Well, I mean, you got to give it to them.
Yes.
you got to give it to them. When I saw that stuff, I said, well, that shit is bad. That shit is good. Well, and here, let's go. So the Ola Uda Equiano. So how many people in here have read the narrative of this? So here's the thing. There's a moment in the narrative, and you have to keep in mind that when Ola Uda is writing the narrative, he's a grown man now, but he describes from the moment he and his sister were first kidnapped, and ultimately sold into slavery. And he describes this experience when he gets on the ship, on the boat. And he says that the moment that when I realized these white men were not going to eat me, I started to recognize that they were men who were superior to us. And at that moment, I wanted to be everything that they were, to do everything they did, to learn everything they knew. Now that moment, that crystallizes, I think, what you just described as the challenge. Because the reality was, as an adult looking back on that moment, he's still describing the fact that what was happening here was more than what we were where I came from. In his perception, that's what he saw. And he wanted to be all that. Because what he didn't want to do is to always be seen as being behind. And the reality is that I don't want to be in a position where I have to count on people making a way for me. I don't want that. I want to make a way where, I want to be able to look at the world and shape the world according to my own ideals, to my own desires, and to distribute the benefits of it to whoever I want to distribute it to make knowledge available to whoever I think would likely make good use of it. That's sort of what it is. We flew over here on jet airplanes. It only took us 7 hours to get from Chicago to Heathrow. Well, that's pretty good.
Thank you very much.
All right.
Another question? If not, I've got one. No? Okay, over here. And then I might ask one more. Just one row down.
As a black man that's exhibiting, do you see any irony in the fact that you're exhibiting in a place that was actually created on the oppression of black people? The Tate, sugar, plantations. And now we've come full circle. We've been talking a lot about history. I just was interested in your thoughts on that, if you had any.
Well, I'm aware, but here's the thing that you have to keep. I think we can't ignore the fact that that knowing that history, there's still lots of people dying on ships in the North Atlantic trying to get over here, and there are going to be more people dying on ships trying to get over here.
But
too.
I'm referring to people who are forced to.
Yeah, but we're talking about people.
Not people that are actually elected. Not people that have elected to come here to try and sort of go across the border.
Yeah, but the thing is, like, we're here now, and we got to deal with this. We got to deal with this. You got to get what you want out of what's available to you now. You got to get that now.
Yeah, in the middle.
I'm Deborah Smith, and I curated Kerry's show nearly 13 years ago at Camden. You make it seem quite seamless, and it has been quite a journey, I think, with you only stopping teaching probably like 15 years ago. Can you tell a bit about why you think it's shifted now with your work being in major collections all around the world, rather than at the time we were showing you, they were still in collections, but they were probably obviously less collections, and you're now a very sought after artist to be in collections. What do you think has been the turning point within that period?
Longevity.
Probably.
You hang around long enough. you keep doing what you got to do. Well, but on some level, I think the question you ask points to a way in which we misunderstand what's actually going on in the world. Because that question implies that on some level that everybody who is sort of famous as an artist just sort of became famous. That there was no contestation, that there was no give and take, that amongst people who were really well known as artists, there weren't people who didn't like what they did or who didn't understand what they did at the time they were doing it. That it implies that there's somehow, that for some people there's a smooth path to getting to the top, and for other people there's a harder path to get to the top. It's hard for everybody. Really, it is. And so, when you only curated that show because I had a presence in the art world in the first place, for you to recognize as the thing that you could present. So I had already, before I met you, the LA County Art Museum had already bought that painting that was there. The Whitney Museum had already bought a painting that was there. The San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, they had already bought a painting. So it's like, it's not like it's not like my success was inevitable. Because what we have to recognize still is that amongst the people who have the resources to buy artworks either for themselves or to give to museums, there are not a lot of black people participating in that. There are not a lot of black people participating in that. There are even black people who have a lot of money don't buy artwork with the money they have, because this is not a part of a kind of, this is not our marketplace, our market. On a lot of levels, it's not our market. We want to be in it, but it's not our market because most of the money that drives it is not our money. When our money starts driving it, then our money will also shape it. You know, if there's something that we think needs to be different about it, if we think work needs to be in places where it isn't, then we should be buying it and giving it to the places where it ought to be. That's how it happens. And if we're, this is sort of the reality of the thing. And so for me, and for artists, so what do I want? I mean, do I want to keep making this stuff? Yes, I want to keep making it. Do I want to make it in isolation, alone, in my own neighborhood, in my own house, in my garage, and only showing it to people who I know, who are close to me? No, I don't just want to do that. I want to do it on a much bigger stage. And so it was as I described earlier, all the things I did, every way that I thought about my work, and the way I wanted to deploy the use of a black figure in it was designed to get it in a place like this at some point. And the way I see it is that if I don't know, if I can't structure the way I address the art world in a way that gives me a better than 50-50 chance of getting to work where I am, then I have to do some more work. Because you need to have a better than 50% chance that believing that you are going to succeed at exactly what you wanted to do. You got to know that, and you got to decide ahead of time what you want that thing to be. Because if you don't know what it is, if you can't name it, if you can't describe it precisely, then you can't ever get there. I mean, it's like following a road map, and I want to follow the road map and get where I want to go. And so that's sort of how, it's not like, you got to ask, and I ask all the time. It's like, well, why would white people buy work? Why do white people buy pictures that have black people in them? Why would they do that? Because there is no universal idea of what's good in art. There just isn't. Everybody doesn't think everything is as interesting as everything else. There's no one dimension to what makes things good. It's always negotiated. Time, the time in which it occurs has some impact on whether it does or not. But the status of the thing you make, the character of the thing you make does have something to do with it. And I'll go back to this idea of abstraction that Mark was had brought up earlier. The quality of your investigation has something to do with the way people should respond to the work you do. If you're just trying to make pictures because they look nice, lots of people do that. Lots of people. So why would you pick one thing as opposed to another thing? And in this arena, we suppose that people like Mark, who went to school, who got degrees, who studied the history, who look at what's supposed to be important and what's not supposed to be important, that they are applying some kind of knowledge-based measurement to the decisions they're making. Now, I need to know something about the kinds of decisions he's going to make, because I need to know some of the things. I need to know the same things he's going to know. He says he knows. I need to know that too. Because if I know that, then me and Mark can have a conversation. We can talk to each other. If I don't know what he knows, we can't get together on nothing. And so it kind of comes down to that. So in this world, yes, and when I described it, human beings have been making a lot of stuff since human beings were walking upright. So it's not remarkable that people make pictures. That's unremarkable. It's not remarkable that people make sculpture. That's unremarkable. Everybody can do it. But the particular nature of the thing, the particular thing they make, well, that's a whole other thing altogether. So that's where you come into this idea of systems and histories and things like that, because these systems and histories are organized to address a particular point and to outline a particular need or a particular inevitability, or that's what the whole thing about, that's what history is all about. It's the selective emphasis on one thing over another thing. That's what makes history interesting to be engaged with. And the more of that history you know, the more things you can engage with. And I fall back on my favorite analogies. I don't see a whole lot of difference between doing artwork and doing particle physics. There just isn't a whole lot of difference. Either you know that the building blocks of matter are more than just atoms, or you don't. And if you don't know it, then there are things you can't do. If you do know it, and you're looking at all of those other particles that make up the building blocks of matter, then you can start doing other kinds of things. If you take the Human Genome Project, what is the purpose of sequencing the human genome? The purpose of sequencing the human genome is to find out what effect each one of those genes has on the development of and the health of a human body. Once you know what those things do, then you can start to do things to affect the way in which those genes express themselves. But if you don't know that, then there's stuff you can't do. So anyway. Anyway.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.